So we just talked about SVG and some basic shapes. So let's pick up where we left off and talk about binding data using D3. So we can get rid of the rectangles that we had. Let's go ahead and make our SVG a little bit bigger. And we have this circle left. So the first thing that we're going to need is data, right? So I have a data set copied here. You can see it as a JSON, and this is actually Anscombe's quartet. So you've seen this before. So that's the first set, that's the second set, the third set, and so we have that as data. Right here we appended a single circle element. The first part here we made a D3 selection. So just to talk a little bit more about selections, to be a little more careful, right? We said D3 select SVG, right? And what we could have done is we could have stored that selection. So if we stored that selection in a variable S, then we could have taken that selection and appended a circle. When we're working with selections, it's always important, and the most important thing to keep track of is what's in a selection. So if you're keeping track of in your head what's in each selection, you're going to have a good idea of the state of your visualization and be able to build whatever you want. Here, our selection, when we made D3 select SVG, right, our S is a selection with one element, right? So what we could do is we could go ahead and look at S, right? And just to keep this straight in our head, if we go ahead and look at the variable S, well, it's not accessible to us here, but if we do go ahead and take a look at S, we're going to see it's a selection with one element, right? So this runs, right, and here's our selection with one element in it. So this is our selection object, and of course these are the selection methods that we have. So we want to talk about doing a data bind. So the first thing that we're going to need to bind data is we're going to need a selection. So I'm going to go ahead and create some rectangles on this circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty selection. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to create some new rectangles. I'm going to say var rex equals d3.selectAll of rex of rect. So let's take all of them, and here we have this selection here is actually an empty selection, right? So that's the important thing to keep in mind. It didn't matter that we selected rect here. We could have selected anything that would be empty. All we really know here at the end is that we have the result of an empty selection in rect. So if we go ahead and do a data bind, we're going to need some data, right? And then we're going to need a selection. So we can go ahead and bind data to our selection using the .data method of the selection. So here we apply data with .data on rect, right? And we could, and so the selection has been updated with data. So now we can go ahead and do things with that data bind. Going back to our selection, the important thing to know here, our selection was empty, right? So the data bind will create 3 sub-selections for us. Those are the selection here will be the enter, update, and exit selection. So that it all depends on the state of our selection. So if our selection here was empty, right? So we know this is an empty selection. Is it going to let me do a comment? Empty selection, right? So that was an empty selection. Now we have data elements applied. So we have four data elements in a list applied. So we went ahead and bound that data to all the rectangles. There weren't any. So what we can go ahead and do is we can take this selection here, right, this data bind, and we can create the new elements that didn't exist. So enter is going to, off of a data selection, .enter is going to give us the new elements that didn't exist, right? So it's going to go ahead and say, okay, we had 4 pieces on data here. It was a list of length 4, right? And what we might have wanted to do is go ahead and do the inner list, right? So here we're going to append this first list here, which is a list of JSON tuples here, of JSON objects with 2 entries, and we appended the data. Now we have the enter selection, and we can go ahead and based on the length of our data, go ahead and start creating elements. So this is the basic cycle here, right? And what we can do is we go ahead and create a rect element. So because our data had, we can look at the length of this, right? So if we wanted to look at how many elements we're appending, right, we can look at the length of our data. So if we go ahead and look at the console here, their console tool doesn't always work super well, so we can go ahead and check our own. So we had an array of length 11 as data of 0, and we had an empty selection. So .enter is going to create those 11 elements that didn't already exist, and on each of those that didn't already exist, we can go ahead and append a new rectangle element. Now within each of those rectangles, now we can begin to apply styles. We can set the X attribute, and we can do this based on the data that we appended. So here we had a list of length 11. So each of these 11 new ones that got created by the enter selection have that data element that was in the list. So here, function of D, we can return the X attribute of that, return D.X. So it was that little JSON that was passed in, that the JavaScript object that was in the list is now accessible via D, because that data is bound to each of these rectangles. So we bound the data to the empty selection, created the 11 that didn't exist, and those each have the data bound to them. So now with the data bound to each of these rectangle elements, we can go ahead and use that data to apply styles to it. So here we only set the X, right? We need to go ahead and set the Y and the width and height of these, and we should be able to see these on the page. So what we can do is we can go ahead and do that, right? So we take the Y, we'll just set it to be the D.Y, right? And these rectangles are also going to need a width and height. So let's give them width 5. And height 5. Right, so now we should have these 11 new data elements appended to the web page. We could give them an X, Y, width, and height. So let's go ahead and look at what we had here for these rectangle elements. So if we go ahead and look at what was created here, let's pop this out. We go ahead and look at our SVG. Right here we created these rectangle elements over here, right, because we weren't careful with our selection. So actually we wanted to go and select those off of the SVG. So instead, if we did a sub-selection, we selected all the recs on the SVG, then we actually appended those rec elements in the SVG. So here they are. And that's taking a data list here and binding it to elements on the page. Here we had to create those elements. The other things, there's two other scenarios, right? The elements already existed, so you can update them, or the data was shorter than the number of elements. So you go ahead and delete extra elements in that case. That's the exit selection. So you got the enter, update, and exit. Usually you'll do it in the other order. You exit, delete the extra ones, enter, create new ones, and update all of the data elements in the page. So that's it for binding data.
So CodePen describes itself as a social development environment for front-end developers. And indeed, there's a growing number of these sorts of tools out there, including JS Fiddle, that allow you to, well, one, we can use it for a learning environment, allow you to build, test things, potentially debug, tinker with code, and you'll also see a fair amount of times these sorts of tools used to share code on Stack Overflow, and as people try to provide different ways for doing things and debug. So please do note that this is different than how you might set things up within a local directory if you're actually getting code ready to ship. So you'd most likely be using some sort of text editor for that. So as an example here, we have Sublime Text, and you can see that it's similar in that you might have your HTML and then a file for your CSS and JavaScript, or you can put your CSS and JavaScript within your HTML. But it's a different setup. And we'll be talking through that further in a later section for doing it within a local environment and setting it up using your Python server. So for just getting started with things and getting started playing with web programming and HTML and CSS, we will create a very simple table structure. And we'll be working with JavaScript momentarily, but for now I'm going to push it aside and note that you can change the look and feel of your particular pen. And it provides a nice way to see what's going on as you build it. So let's start building out a table here. So, whoops. Okay. So we have our head and our body, right? And we'll start building out the table using the table element. Now I want to point out a couple of additional resources as well here. So one of them is the Mozilla Foundation has some great documentation for developers for web programming. So here there's a bunch of content on web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So let's go back and take a look at the HTML element reference for tables and take a look at some of those elements because we will be using them. Okay, so for table content, so you can see there's things such as the column element. There's table. We already have the table element there for representing tabular data. And we'll be adding TD, the element for data within a particular cell. Table header, we'll also be working with the TR for the rows of the table for right now. But it's helpful to be able to reference this and get a sense of what each particular element does. Okay, let's go back to our pen here. And we want to start building out, let's put in some rows. And we want the first row to be our header. So let's see, we can have, this is obviously going to depend on the structure of your data, but in our particular case, we can imagine that we have a data set that has names, and let's say it also has IDs here, and what else? Let's say countries. Okay, whoops. So you can see here that it's already showing up as it might within the browser. So this is helpful to check things as we go along. And we have our first row there that just has the headers. Now we need to add some data as well. So let's actually create another row. And we're going to put some table data in here. Let's see. So we have names. Whoops, let's see. It's not right. We don't need a name there. We need an ID. Thinking a little bit ahead of things there. Okay, so here we have now 2 rows, and just copy and paste this. Okay. And let's add one more for now, but you can see how this could continue on. And so on. Okay. Oops. Okay, so we have some data in here, and so we have a pretty basic table structure. So let's style it a bit. So again, the cascading, here we have our cascading style sheet, and this consists of our selector, which selects the particular element that we want to style, and then properties in which we're going to style it with. So we can do this, apply this directly to the different elements here. So let's see, let's first, let's apply some background color to our header. And we'll need to be able to see the text there too. Okay. And let's also take a look at the font for the table here. Okay. And also, not particularly happy with the spacing here, so let's provide some padding as well for the header and data. And you can play with this to see what works for you. Okay, so let's pick some better colors here as well. So there's any number of sites you can go to get a sense of different colors to use. Another good resource to know about is the W3 schools. So they have tutorials on all sorts of things, as you can see, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc., Bootstrap even. But I'm just going to use it right now to grab some hexadecimal colors. So let's find something that is a little nicer here for the background. Let's see. There we go. And what else? Okay. Well, I guess that's okay to keep that white for now. Another thing that we can do, as Annette was talking about in potentially coloring different things for the different rows of data. So here we can for each row, here we can use the nth child. And we can actually select certain rows this way. So I'm just going to show you to get a sense of it now. So if I wanted the background color to be, let's pick a different, how about a nice blue? Okay, I'll grab this hexadecimal color. Okay. Might need to be lighter to see it better. But you can see here that we've selected the third row. Now what we really would want to do is, let's add, so you can see this here, let's add another. What you might really want to do is select just even rows, so we can actually do that here. And you can see now that it is just providing the background color for those particular rows. Now, beyond providing the, here for the CSS, just putting in the particular elements, you can also use selectors, including the class or ID. So I'm just going to show that really quickly. So if we wanted to, let's say for some reason we wanted to highlight here a particular country, so I can go to here, I can use an ID. We can call this whatever we want. Okay. And then for the particular ID, I can use let's see, how do I want to do this? So differences between using a class and ID. So in this case, I'm using ID, in which there's really only, if you have one unique thing that you want to select, then you'd use ID. Classes is if there are multiple. So for an ID here, call out, and let's just change, let's give it a different background color. Okay, so not the prettiest table in the world, but in the next section, Annette will be working with us to do a much more elegant table, and also be working with a larger data set in JSON and working with JavaScript to do that. But here we have our first table using HTML and CSS.